Greetings and salutations, friends, and welcome back to more Warhammer lore. As today we are talking about the Slayer cult, or the Drengi as the Dwarves call them. These wandering little hazard lights are a big part of Dwarven culture, as it provides one of, well, very few, if not indeed the only escape, for a dwarf that has lost his honor, which is of course a dwarf's single most precious possession, without which he is less than nothing. And so when a dwarf takes the Slayer Oath, he becomes nothing. For all intents and purposes, for the rest of dwarfdom, that dwarf is dead. And the Slayer himself now but needs to go out in the world in search of a worthy way to make that societal death a real one. Unsurprisingly, the dwarves are not over-eager to talk about this particular part of their culture, as they believe, understandably and rightfully so, that the majority of the other civilized races of the world wouldn't really understand. And for quite some time, detailed knowledge about these bright orange-haired Mohawked maniacs remained a, not guarded necessarily, but de facto secret. That is until the Slayers were made very, very popular indeed, both in and out of universe, amusingly enough, by the very self-same source, namely Felix Jaeger and his adventures with Gotrek Gurnisson, the single most unsuccessful Slayer in the entire history of the Dwarven race. A Slayer so shit at dying that even the literal end of the world saw his oath unfulfilled till the very end. But we shan't talk too much about Gotrek Gurnisson in this video. Instead, we are going to talk about the Slayer cult at large and in general. Starting, of course, with the origins of the Slayer cult. Or, more correctly, the origins of the Slayer cult, as either due to the real reason being lost to history, or because GW kept forgetting about it. There has been no less than 3 distinct origins for the Slayers. The oldest and, in certain ways, most believable, is that the very first Slayer was one of the very first dwarves, the ancestral gods of the dwarves. This very first Slayer was Grimnir himself, one of the grandest and most widely worshipped of all the ancestor gods. He was the mightiest warrior to have ever lived, and upon hearing that the great portals in the northern realm had broken open, spilling chaos into the old world and threatening to overwhelm the entirety of creation, he picked up his axes, vowed to close the portal with his own 2 hands, and knowing that that was an all but impossible vow, he went with all intent to die in the north. So he shaved his head except for a single line of hair, which he shaped into a great grand Mohawk, the reflection of which, of course, the Slayers don today. What became of Grimnir is unknown. He ventured north, where he fought countless hordes of demons, including greater demons and favored servants of Khorne, and he was mightily wounded in these confrontations. But he was not slain. Not before, at least, he had ordered his descendants to return back to the old world, leaving Grimnir to wander deeper into the Chaos Wastes, where he presumably eventually perished. Or at least that is the mysterious ending that I personally am far more fond of, as the other ending is, well, Grimnir made Gotrek his successor and into the immortal embodiment of dwarven vengeance, which, considering Gotrek's entire purpose was to get himself dead, seems like a rather fierce kick to the crotch to me, but details. Anywho, that is the first origin myth of the Slayers, and it's a pretty good one, as one would imagine that the need to redeem one's honor would be a fundamental one to the dwarves, and therefore it seems safe to assume there has always been a Slayer cult. And both the other origin stories come far later in the history of the dwarves. For example, one origin story claims that the Slayer cult was formed by a dwarf by the name of Gudrun, which, by the way, is a female name, which is intriguing as well. Anywho, Gudrun had vowed to protect the son of his best friend, who just so happened to be King Snorri Morgrimsson, in all due likelihood one of the lower kings scattered throughout the various dwarven Karaks. But whilst out on adventures with the king's son, one Thurgil, the two of them were ambushed by a horde of night goblins, and whilst they fought bravely, Thurgil was slain in the encounter, and whilst Gudrun himself survived — that's a weird sentence for a Norwegian to say, incidentally — he could not, in all due good conscience, return to his king and inform him that not only was his son dead, but his best friend had become an oath breaker. And so he decided to wander the mountain ranges in search of other night goblins, of trolls, and other threats to dwarf kind. And he furthermore also decided to color his own beard and hair orange, supposedly in honor of Thurgil's brilliant red hair. This all sounds like quite the stretch to me, as why would hundreds and thousands of other dwarves decide to mimic the example of this one individual? They don't know King Snorri Morgrimsson, they don't know Thurgil, and they don't know Gudrun. So why would they all decide to emulate his example? As he didn't really go on to do anything particularly remarkable either. He killed some night goblins, he killed some trolls, possibly even a giant, and then simply faded into history. Not even a glorious final death to inspire others. This is not a great origin story, in fact, is definitely the worst one of them all. As the first, with Grimnir, makes the most sense. The second one, with Gudrun, is the worst one, and my personal favorite, actually, comes a little bit later, after the Great War against Chaos, and instead the war against the elves, with an individual by the name of Forek Grimbok. He was a highly skilled and much respected dwarven diplomat, during an era where the dwarves had need for such things. He lived under the reign of Gotrek Starbreaker, one of the greatest dwarf high kings to have ever lived. A wise and mighty ruler he was, and so when his realm seemed to be embroiled in more and more niggling little conflicts with their, at the time, beloved allies, the High Elves, Starbreaker dispatched Forek Grimbok to the court of Calador, to the person of Calador II himself, to discuss these various happenstances, insults against the dwarves, apparent assaults upon their outposts, attack on personnel, murders, thefts, all kinds of scrupulous and roughish behavior that Gotrek himself could hardly believe the elves capable of. However, Calador II was far less of a diplomat than Gotrek or Forek were. He viewed the dwarves as filthy dirt grubbers, as creatures infinitely far beneath himself, as allies in essence only in name. And so when a gathering of these small, smelly, bearded creatures appeared before him, in the midst of his more pleasant distractions, he simply dismissed their concerns out of hand, found them in fact to be insulting. How dared these dirt grubbers come to his court and demand recompense for crimes he had not committed? And so he ordered the ambassadors' beards to be shaved. This is by far the greatest insult anyone could ever levy against a dwarf. It is to reduce them to babies, to infants, to helpless individuals, bereft of status, bereft of honor, bereft of wisdom, age, and experience. It is a crime from which they could never recover. And so the diplomats returned home in tremendous shame, crying as they delivered the news to a furious Gotrek Starbreaker. And unable to continue to live with the shame, the diplomats then went to the shrine of Grimnir, who was already, of course, a venerated ancestral god, and made furious promises and oaths of vengeance upon the elves, that they would not rest until they had punished those who had wronged them. Donning special steel masks to disguise their shame, and taking for themselves the names Steelbeards, they armed and armored themselves as best they could, and launched themselves into what was at that time, in essence, a border skirmish-style war with the High Elves. This conflict would, of course, eventually grow into a full-scale, outright war between the elves and the dwarves. The War of Vengeance, or the War of the Beards, as it was also called. But even dwarves can die in war, of course, especially against a foe as mighty as the High Elves at the peak of their power. And the last straw that finally broke Grimbok's mind was the death of his old friend Rundin, himself a famous warrior who had killed many monstrous creatures. He fell to the High Elves, and to honor his memory, Grimbok went back after the war to the shrine of Grimnir, vowing that he would follow in his slain friend's footsteps and seek out the greatest, vilest creatures in the world and face them, in order to finally redeem himself in a glorious death. And this was also where he shaved his hair, gave himself countless tattoos, and placed it in a Mohawk to resemble Grimnir. His actions, his heroics during the war, his memory of the insult delivered to him at the hands of the elves, and his later successes as a slayer were all examples that would be followed by countless other dwarves taking up the Slayer's Oath. This is my favorite by far, because it sounds plausible, a great insult delivered towards a dwarf, a great loss that justifies the need to go out and fight particularly powerful foes, and a final atonement in death for the Slayer in question. This is an example that I could see other dwarves follow if they too were on the receiving end of equal insults. Unlike the Gudrun example where, okay, so you took an oath to avenge your slain friend. This in and of itself is not particularly rare amongst the dwarves. But an oath to die, however, that's rather unusual, because make no mistake, the Slayer Oath is not an oath to go out and kill wicked, vicious, monstrous creatures. It is to die whilst doing so. Bearing in mind, though, that to die without doing one's darndest is just as shameful as needing to take the oath in the first place. And if a dwarf has already abandoned all honor, he cannot possibly allow himself to sink any lower. And so a slayer must struggle against his demise with all the strength and might in his body. A slayer cannot allow himself to be killed. He cannot do anything but his utmost to always win and to live to slay another monster. This, incidentally, is also why many slayers over the years tend to grow remarkably batshit insane. As if a slayer takes the oath and then goes out to be eaten by the first troll they come across, then, well, that is actually a very successful slayer. That is a happy slayer. That is a slayer that fulfilled his final oath and redeemed himself in death. A slayer, however, that has killed trolls, giants, demons, dragons, gods on certain occasions, that is the unhappiest of all slayers, because seemingly nothing's capable of putting this mad barking dog out of its damned misery. And there is no other way to fulfill the oath either. It is simply to die. Although there was one example where the Slayer King, Ungrim Ironfist, with Ungrim itself meaning oath unfulfilled, having managed to get out of the Slayer Oath. Now, Ungrim Ironfist is, of course, the king of Garagrim, the Slayer Keep, home to the largest temple to Grimni in all of Dwarfdom. The Slayer King of Garagrim originally took up the title many centuries ago, around 600-700 years before the beginning of the imperial calendar, when the then king of Garagrim, before it became the Slayer Keep, one Baragor, was attacked by a mighty dragon in the mountains of the world's edge. This would be a shitty enough situation at the best of times, but to make things worse, the king was not alone. He was traveling with his retinue and a newly-wed couple, Baragor's son and the daughter of the Dwarven High King of Karaz-a-Karak. The young bride was killed during the attack, snapped up and whisked away by the dragon. Unsurprisingly, this was not something that the king took very well at all. Baragor set after it, the beast having been identified as Skaladrak in Cardine, a monstrous beast of quite some infamy. And he proved too much of a match even for the Dwarven King, his rage and his retinue. Baragor was left standing on the ground as the monster soared up into the air, clutching only a single scale that he had managed to cleave from the creature's flank. Vowing that he would slay the creature, but unable to pursue it, lest he break his other oath to rule Garagrim wisely, the king found himself in a bind. He could not pursue the dragon, for to do so would break his oath as a king. He could not maintain his position as king, because he would be an honorless cur unless he slew the dragon. And so a compromise solution was arrived at, where the king would remain a slayer, and would, whenever possible, attempt to fulfill his oath, but he would otherwise remain the king of Garagrim. But as he could not seek an honorable death in battle, which means he would have to die a dishonored individual, an arrangement was instead made where every one of his sons would pick up the oath in the father's stead, thereby allowing the oath to continue without dooming the king. Thereafter, each member of his line would take up the name Ungrim, Oath Breaker or Oath Broken, until the days of Iron Fist. Iron Fist had a son, Garagrim Iron Fist. He did not need to take up the name because, of course, he was not king. However, being a surprisingly clever individual, despite his remarkable appearance, Garagrim discovered a loophole in the ancient vow. If the king or a descendant of the king needed to die to fulfill the oath, well, then that meant that Garagrim could take up the oath for himself, then march off to war, get himself killed, and voila! His father's oath, his great-great-great-great ancestor's oath, would be fulfilled. And the Iron Fist line would no longer be cursed. And whilst it took Garagrim a good long while to find something badass enough to kill him, he eventually found something, although that exact something is not recorded, freeing his father and his ancestors from the Slayer Oath. You want to know what Ungrim Iron Fist did then? Well, he figured that since his son got himself killed to save his father from the Slayer's Oath, he figured that he was the one responsible for his son's death. And since he, in turn, had then killed his son, well, obviously he was a dishonorable cur who could only possibly conceivably redeem himself by taking the Slayer's Oath. And so, Ungrim Iron Fist wandered down to the Shrine of Grimnir and took the Slayer Oath that he had just been released from again. Fucking dwarves. On the bright side, Ungrim did also eventually manage to get himself killed too, though not at the hand of a beast or a monster, but at the Warhammer equivalent of a nuclear bomb, which, you know what? Nuke Slayer? That might just be the ultimate title. The end of the road when everything else has failed. Well, charge a thermonuclear device, and there'll be an end to your story one way or another. But for many dwarves, it's not quite that simple. As when a dwarf does something that requires them to take the Slayer Oath, and this can be, in essence, any great shame that they bear. It could be the death of a kinsman. It could be the loss of a child. It could be having actually wronged someone and wishing to make atonement. Take, for example, the rather famous dwarven engineer, Malachi Mackay's son. He took the Slayer Oath after his rather unfortunately named boat, the Unsinkable, sank, and after his airship, the Indestructible, blew up, killing many dwarves in the process. Shamed by his incredibly poor sense of naming things, he shaved his head and became a Slayer. Once this happens, the Slayer is expected to give up any and all earthly possessions, except for a weapon and a piece of armor, some basic protection. This is not necessarily an absolute enforced standard, as Malachi himself owns airships, guns, artillery, etc. But most of the time it is expected, as again, the purpose of a slayer is to die, and so bringing even more gear along is usually counterproductive. These young slayers are generally styled as troll slayers, as they're expected to go out and fight trolls, as surely no mere gobby or raki can kill them, so they gotta aim a little bit higher. They are exiled, of course, from their homes. They are, well, dead for all societal purposes, and they are not shunned necessarily by other dwarves, but they're not embraced either, as the rest of dwarfendom has a very strange relationship with slayers. On the one hand, it could easily be argued that a slayer is the ultimate expression of the dwarven sense of honor, someone that has elected to throw away their own life, to sacrifice their own existence in order to regain that honor. But on the other hand, it also means, of course, that the slayer in question must have done something so heinous that only death could possibly redeem them. Nevertheless, most other dwarves will elect to at the very least provide shelter, food, and basic support to dwarves they encounter on the Slayer's path, to help them along on their way. As of course, simply starving to death somewhere is not a very honorable end. Presuming the dwarf manages to find something to fight, though, they will, as previously mentioned, be expected to do their darndest to stay alive and to kill their enemy using their axes. The axe being, of course, the favoured weapon of the Slayers, as they style themselves after Grimnir. The ancestor god wielded 2 axes, and so do the Slayers, although some will occasionally choose to use either a single, larger 2-handed axe, or, in the case of the, even by Slayer standards, nutty-putty followers of Garagrim Iron Fist do, they wield axes at the end of chains. These are the Doom Seekers, a somewhat superfluous name, one would think, but it comes from their weapon. The weapon is an axe blade at the end of a lengthy chain. A weapon equally as likely to decapitate the dwarf as anything around him, you would think, was first pioneered by Garagrim Iron Fist, who kept losing his weapons by, burrowing them too deep into his enemies, or otherwise having them slip out of his blood-slicked hands, so he figured, might as well tie them to his wrists. Well, now suddenly, however, he realized that if he swung his arms a certain way and let go, well, that proved remarkably useful. So, the obvious solution, therefore, was to lengthen the chains. Other Slayers, seeing this ridiculously dangerous way of fighting, naturally elected to emulate his example immediately. As in this respect, Garagrim is a greater visionary than Makai-son by quite some extent. Now again, this is obviously a fantastically dangerous weapon to anyone within 2 meters of the dwarf, including the dwarf. But it does turn them into absolute wrecking balls when fighting against massed enemies, so there is that. And, well, they'd better be wrecking balls, because they don't carry much in the way of protection. Obviously, again, the goal of a Slayer is to die, but they can't die easily. And so they are expected to do the bare minimum to protect themselves as well. Usually this comes in the form of a simple piece of armor, a set of chainmail perhaps, or some studded leather or the equivalent. But some dwarves also tattoo themselves with what is supposed to be warding and magical tattoos. Now, this doesn't actually work, mind you, as whilst the orcs have magical tattoos, the dwarven magic doesn't quite work in that way. Dwarven rune magic is designed to be imbued into stone, a sacred and everlasting material. The simple flesh of a dwarf is probably not quite so sturdy, yet many dwarven slayers swear by them, claiming that their tattoos protect them against evil, vile magic, or even projectile weaponry. I doubt this, but it is a world of magic and nonsense after all, and if the orcs can do it, why can't the dwarves do it as well? The tattoos also serve a second, more practical purpose, to keep score, in essence, as there are specific tattoos that denote specific sorts of prey. One tattoo might indicate that the slayer in question has killed a troll, another a giant, another again that he has fought against the forces of chaos, another that he has fought in a particular battle or against a particular warlord, or a special tattoo to indicate some great feat of arms. And in the case of one particularly unsuccessful slayer, Gotrek Gurnisson decided to go one step further by having his tale immortalized in the books of Felix Jaeger. Granted, Gotrek didn't ask for any of that necessarily, but Gotrek Gurnisson is the vainest of all slayers, which, by the way, is why he just can't die either. He figures it'll look bad, you see, so he just keeps himself alive indefinitely. Or, well, indefinitely up until the point where he got resurrected, but yet again we are trying not to touch too much upon that particular piece of lore. And as a slayer gains more tattoos, well, two things happen. On the one hand, the Slayer's reputation within dwarf society increases, as they can clearly recognize that this Slayer has done great deeds in the name of dwarvendom. He has killed trolls, giant dragons, and all manners of vile creatures that might otherwise inconvenience the dwarves. This is a worthy service indeed, but it also drives the Slayer himself slowly but surely increasingly insane. As, again, bear you in mind, the Slayer wants to die. The Slayer doesn't want to live through the next fight. The Slayer wants to get ended by the next 2-meter-tall behemoth he comes across. Nothing would make a Slayer happier than being smushed to death beneath a tree trunk wielded by a giant. And so, as they go up against more and more dangerous creatures and don't die, they'll start getting desperate. They'll start worrying that nothing can put them down, and that they will die of old age, of weakness, or some other inconvenience. It is a little bit unclear if a Slayer's oath is fulfilled if they die during a journey, like being swept off a mountaintop or something like that, for example, but it is undoubtedly a far less desirable end than an honorable one in battle. This is often why many Slayers sign up to join Slayer armies, usually headed out from Garagrim. These armies, these vast and rather ragtag and uncontrollable war hosts, are usually sent off or gathered when there is a particular need for suicidal madness. For example, during a great war against chaos, where the king of Garagrim will raise a Slayer host and venture forth into the craziest, most unsurvivable confrontations in the old world. This is perfect for the Slayers themselves, as in a massive battlefield, they don't need to rely on one opponent to take care of them. They could get pulped by a cannonball, stepped on by a dragon, or simply swept aside by a cavalry charge. There are infinite and welcome opportunities to end oneself on a battlefield. Sadly, wars of that scale are pretty rare, few, and far between. Though, due to the nature of Slayers to always seek out conflict and beasts, there are, on occasion, groups of Slayers that gather together before battles. Not as a part of any organized army, but simply because, oh hey, you're here to get killed too. Cool, let's get killed together. Creating ad hoc little bands of Slayers. They have often helped the armies of the Empire, armies of fellow dwarves, or any other groups that they can at least stomach standing alongside for long enough to try and get themselves murdered by the opposition. But finally, if a battlefield can't kill them, if a troll, a giant, or a dragon can't kill them, if the beasts of the ocean or hordes of orcs and goblins can't kill them, if the deep, dark tunnels of the Raki can't bring an end to their lives, the final refuge of a Slayer is to try to become a demon slayer. Those Slayer dwarves who have finally just given up on everything, having been unable to find anything big and scary enough to stomp them out, will eventually decide to just head north. After all, if Grimnir himself managed to get killed up there, then surely there's gotta be something spiky enough to put a regular dwarf out of his misery as well. These demon slayers are usually the end form of slayers, as yes, in most cases, there is indeed something up in the far north that can put down even a slayer. Be it hordes, massive chaos warbands, rampaging swarms of possessed creatures, demons which literally simply pop back into the realm of chaos to re-emerge minutes later, or massive, monstrous servants of the dark gods. There's usually something in the north that can kill even a dwarf, allowing them to find some respite, even though we might argue that being that close to a collapsed warp gate is not the best remedy for one's soul, not even a dwarf's. But hey, if nothing else will do, then demons will just have to serve. That is the lonely and potentially long and painful road of a dwarven slayer. But most can at least count themselves lucky that they're never going to be Gotrek Gurnisson, a legend and a failure at the exact same time. Until next time, I have been Arch. Thank you all very much for listening, and I do hope to see you all again soon. Till then, have a good day.